Time to do the September reading wrap-up, starting with 2-star reads. Politian by Edgar Allan Poe. This is Poe's only play manuscript. It's an unfinished one. He started writing and releasing it in a magazine. It ended up not doing well, so he stopped. I think he had a couple more segments that had been unreleased until he was basically forced into releasing it in a poetry collection a little further down the line. That author had asked, "Where's the end of Politian?" And Poe had sort of dismissively been like,
"There is no more Politian, and there never will be."
I think the making of Politian, Poe's feelings about Politian, the response to Politian, all of that is a much more interesting story than the actual play itself. A lot of Edgar Allan Poe's works focus on totality, where every single element of the story is driving towards this, and Poe has a significant level of control in his writing, and I don't think plays lend themselves to that style. When you write a screenplay, it's almost entirely dialogue with like very vague setups on where people are or what they're doing, because all that stuff is sort of decided by the person who's actually putting the play on. Some of Poe's work in these plays where he's giving elaborate setups and like where he's dictating how characters should move across the stage or how characters should sound is unconventional within plays and scripts. He should have just done this in like a short story sort of fashion if he wanted this level of control. Beyond that, the play itself is not super engaging. It is mimicking real life events that happened at the time, although Poe like set it up in ancient Rome. Reading it reminded me a lot of Shakespeare's historical plays, which to me are Shakespeare's weakest play set. Politian is only fun to read and look at in comparison to Poe's larger works or in comparison to the Gothic movement. Now that I have read something of his where dialogue was the main form of getting information across, I'm just not sure he's good at it. I'm also not confident he's very good at character interactions and relationships. Next is Escaping Captivity by R.K. Munin. This is the second book in a Talon alien romance series. Like most of these alien romances, each one of these books could stand alone, so you could read them out of order. But similar to Ice Planet Barbarians, this specific one has an overarching plot that's happening in the background of like the romance series. And I had just finished reading the first book in the series and was really hyped for this series with very high expectations because we had just done Sora's character, who had been like an abused person who'd been in prison for a long time, and now we were moving over to Lakin, who had been a free person recently captured during one of her rebellion missions, tortured, and now put into captivity. So I felt like comparing the two of them was going to be really interesting, as well as like her interpretation of loss of freedom and agency versus Sora, and in particular because free living in this universe is harsh and difficult and takes a lot of struggle and it's like not very high quality. Maybe we would have had like an interesting conversation about what the value of freedom and agency is in comparison to living well in captivity, which is something thematically that's always been interesting to me, partially because I'm American and we value freedom and agency a lot, but partially too because I care a lot specifically about animal welfare, and something that I often grapple with is whether or not you can keep animals in captivity well, and whether it's better to be in captivity and therefore no longer afraid of predators and whatnot, so long as your captivity is like a decent size and provides adequate enrichment. And certainly we cannot ask animals this, so it's something that I just sort of have to grapple with, never really knowing, and something that a lot of these alien romances and even alien horror stories tackle really well is when they put the human as like a human pet or a human captive in some way, shape, or form. They're sort of experiencing this same like outside is bad, in here you're treated much better kind of theming, and what do they as a sentient species prefer. This story obviously doesn't do it well because it's here at 2 stars. Lakin goes from really valuing her freedom, really being invested in like the human rebellion and human welfare as like free, independent species, to being like, I love this, without any sort of slow move into it. And I don't think it's believable for her character, but I also think it's like a very shallow interpretation of what's going on in series period. And honestly, Sora as a character in the first book, who was originally born free, was sold into captivity by her uncle for money and went through like some brutalization and then came to like this better situation. Her opinions and thoughts on being in captivity versus being free was more nuanced than Lakin's, and Lakin has spent most of her adult life free and fighting for the freedom and support of others, so I just didn't like that at all. It might have really been just me being too hyped and expecting too much from this story, but they set it up in a really interesting and engaging way in book one and did not deliver. Some of the stuff that they left like vague and open-ended, like whether or not people around Lakin have come to see her as her own being and an equal peer, whether or not they respect her agency and give her her space and right to make choices, or whether or not they're like very paternal, is not cleared up. And I understand that the alien species she is engaging with have some misconceptions about humans that then humans have kind of played up for their own personal comfort and benefit, but she is there literally confronting those expectations and like way surpassing what they think humans are capable of, being a lot tougher and stronger and smarter. And some of the aliens do know better. They know their literature is portraying things in a specific agenda way to be beneficial to the species as a whole. So even if she doesn't change the entire species perception, I think with her specific love interest and with the guy Holoran, and probably with Siren given his relationship with Sora, there should have been like some kind of understanding that happens. I guess that's a lot to expect from the book, but it is what it is, moving me into 3 stars. Rise of the Riverman by LSOD. For full disclosure, I got this ebook copy for free during some kind of free ebook deal. And also the cover that you're seeing right now versus the cover that's on Amazon are way different. This cover sort of implies that it's some kind of alien romance. The cover on Amazon is darker and more menacing and more fitting of the tone as a whole. There is a romantic subplot that I feel is shallow and done like with mixed elements. Since the main focus of the short story is like on this one character, body horror and transformation they're going through, as well as like some of the cruelty they've endured overall, that was good. It was a small, compact little science fiction story in that regard. There were definitely some world building elements that needed to be fleshed out a little bit. I was uncertain if the 3 stratospheres of people were 3 different classes or if they were literally 3 different species. The way they were talking about intelligence and capability across the 3 classes made me wonder if this was a nurture or a nature thing or a speciesist thing. That doesn't get clarified. So there's the whole thing that like this dude is doing these experiments on these people that's highly unethical and very body horror, regressive, weird, right? Which I am fine with, except then you need like an ultimate goal or a reason, and there's no apparent reason except that he's curious. And I don't know, I guess that could have made sense if I had known just a little bit more about their society or their government as a whole. But as it stands, it's so far removed from like my day-to-day life, I was left wondering. The writing and the language is super simple, but we're getting a perspective from a person who has like very limited education and like a small range upbringing, so I think it's okay. If you take it for what it is, I think it's a fun little bit of like a scary, chilling kind of read. It's got like a sort of sad, bittersweet ending on it. Next is going to be Heat of the Everflame by Penn. This is the 3rd book in the Everflame series. I picked this one up specifically because Bookish Realms really enjoyed the 1st book in the series, and spoilers for later in this video, I really liked the 1st book too, and that's how I got here to the 3rd one. This 3rd one just happens to not be it for me. It lacks direction and focus. We're retreading a lot of the same character beats we've already done before. It's got like that trope where I feel like everything could be solved with a conversation. It just feels like the author was running out of steam when they were writing this. Like the pacing and the tone and everything like that is just shifted up in a way that seems lesser and not just different, but like actively worse than what's come before. I'm still invested enough that I want to read the 4th book, but this one here is rough to get through. If you haven't read this far into the series and were considering picking up the 3rd book, personally, I would wait so you can read the 3rd book and then jump right into the 4th when it comes out later next year. Long Long Captivity by R.M. Munin. Now this is the first of that series that I rated the second book lower in. This one is about Sora and Siren's relationship. It's fine. I think it's pretty standard alien romance tropes. Like there's some horror elements, there's some things that are like incredibly dark and terrifying, played in with what's generally a softer kind of funny tone, which seems out of place in most series, but I will say in an alien romance it's sort of kind of expected. Like a lot of times these very dark and terrifying things just like pop out of a bush on you and then they just disappear like it was never even there. I think the summary of this series does a great job pulling you into this book. It actually like fulfills the prompt, but it does it in an unexpected way, especially because they had dropped a beat down that's meant to foreshadow one thing, but based off of the summary I had it foreshadowing something else entirely that had misdirected me, and I thought that was clever if that was what the author had done intentionally. Even if the author didn't do it intentionally, it's part of what made me have a good time with the story, so I'm going to give credit there. This first book and the second book have a ton of spelling errors in them, but they're not like things that are spelt wrong. They're things that are spelt correctly, but it's literally the wrong word. Or in one case, the main love interest name is Siren, which is S-E-A-R-I-N. But instead of spelling that, they spelt it Searing, S-E-A-R-I-N-G. So that lets me know that this series of books was spell checked and probably grammar checked by a program, but not a real person, and probably not sort of like proofread or final checked before this draft went out. Given that information, the length of these books, the continuity of them, the plotting, and the general grammar and formatting is all super good if just one person did it. Props to the author for that. It definitely needs a human to edit it though, because when I came across it, it would just make me laugh and sort of pop me out of the story for a minute. The final conflict here is a miscommunication trope. I liked how it was executed, although I would have preferred if both Siren and Dalt had ended up like hanging out with Sora together, because Siren and Sora have this love connection, right? But her and Dalt have a strong friendship bond, and I think it would have been interesting to tackle the idea of like the fading that's going on and how humans are preventing the species from the fading from a perspective that sometimes it's a romantic thing and sometimes it's a friendship thing, and both of those kind of strong emotional bonds can work. Additionally, like in the beginning of this novel, Siren was getting a lot of companionship from his friend's human, and like the scent glands in his cheek that release this sort of like, I don't know, possessive oil would get like really full around her, but he wouldn't release it on her because that would have been inappropriate. The friend was fine with that and the human was fine with that, and they were all like, whatever, we're trying to help this guy out. But meanwhile, Sora's relationship with Dalt was such that Dalt's like scent glands never got enlarged and he was never interested in her in that way, which says to me that Siren shouldn't be threatened by Dalt, and like her and Dalt should have been like a protective guardian relationship. Hired him as a guard and like a friend and someone who could be there when Siren wasn't there if he's trusted. Now I suspect that Dalt and Sora are separated specifically so Dalt can go have his own relationship in book 2, but given how that plays out, I would have preferred if Dalt's friend, who rarely talks, had been in the relationship with Lakin. Moving into 4 stars. The Outliers by Kate L. Mary. So I got this first book for free in one of those ebook freebie giveaway deals, and the other 2 books were available via Kindle Unlimited, and that's how I read this whole series. All 3 of these books are in the 4-star category, so I'm not going to really separate them out. I enjoyed my time with main character Indra. I generally found the world building and the motivation, what was going on, was good enough. There was a whole level of discomfort for me with the way the tribal indigenous element was kind of portrayed. There's a couple of different distinct societies, an idealized Western world like brick and mortar home, electricity group, and obviously they're the ones in power, and this is sort of like emblematic of a colonial setup. And Indra goes in, works in those houses as like a very low level servant who can easily be punished or dismissed or anything like that, but she goes in and does this work specifically because she needs the food and the medicine these colonial people give her for her family who's out in the tribal lands. Her group as a whole is called the Outliers but there are 4 distinct tribes with different cultures that are all viewed the same by the colonial people. And the relationships like outside of the colonial home is sometimes adversarial with these other peoples. Like they just don't interact with them all equally. Like they're their own separate unique cultures or whatever, right? And then there's this other subgroup of people who live right outside of the colonial people who are called the F something or whatever. And they're like sort of traditional barbarians clinging on to like the colonial people, relying on them for supplies and stuff. And they're also super mean to like all these outskirt tribes, even though they're sort of all in the same boat, relying on these colonial people at least partially to survive. And in the case of these people right up close to the gate, like 100%. And because each one of these outlier groups is portrayed as their own individual tribe with like unique customs and culture and all that kind of stuff, I started to feel a little uncomfortable. Like, how much is this borrowing from other indigenous cultures? How is this portrayal? Is it accurate or not accurate? Is it stereotypical or not stereotypical? What kind of research went into it? And I still don't really know the answer to any of those questions. And I'd love to hear of someone else's perspective who has more knowledge on that than me. From what I know, everything is generic enough and portrayed neutrally enough by like the main character / good people that it probably passes as like, okay. I'm totally open to being corrected on that point, but just that's how I ended up feeling after reading 3 books of it. This book does kind of fall into the trap where everyone loves or is fixated on the main character Indra, and I mean everyone. Her colonial employer for some reason calls her like her favorite of the servants. That's not really ever explained or explored. Her son is like fixated on her. While we sort of talk about a couple of reasons that could be, I just don't feel it's good enough that he's so hyper fixated on her specifically. The one good like fortress guy fixates on her right away for no apparent reason. In her own home tribe, it feels like people kind of fixate on her too and like give her special treatment or special privilege or specific insight that not everyone gets. This is a fine story for like an adult to read. I think it's meant to be a young adult story, and there are a couple of elements in it that I thought were like, ooh, maybe don't portray this way. I am coming up this story from someone who's like pretty anti-war, anti-killing. Part of what this story portrays is that killing of some people is valid or justified or the only way forward. And it is framed in such a way where I think that tribes had to rebel against the colonialists and they had to start a war, and to get to those people they had to go through the fortress people. But there's a way that could have been portrayed as like a sad and unfortunate thing. It's portrayed as like these fortress people made their choice a long time ago and they're all evil, awful people. And even though there's a small group of the fortress people that we let live and we eventually learn like some backstory on them specifically, it's like they're a small section of non-spoiled batch of these people. I don't feel that way about people or cultures or any of that in general. And I didn't love that Indra, our main character, could just go out there and kill these fortress people indiscriminately without ever feeling any guilt or conflict. Even when she learned she almost indiscriminately killed someone who is actually a good person within this group of people, she's just sort of like, sometimes casualties happen. And in that regard, I didn't think she was like much better than the forces she was fighting against. Also, the fact that her like murdering these people is what heals her after her husband dies, to me was like kind of odd. As a whole, if you're not trying to deconstruct it like that, I think the story is very engaging and interesting. It goes in unpredictable ways. It's a fun dystopian, a post-apocalyptic kind of thing. There's like lots of reveals and discoveries and information, and I think the pacing and all the stuff that we get revealed and that we learn is good too. And I like how it handles multiple love interests. I like the relationships, the beliefs. I like how they challenge those long-held traditions and beliefs and decide what they're going to keep. The language in this one is kind of simple. I think it could have used a little bit of like a rewrite. Someone just coming in and helping to streamline things just a little bit and maybe just like to clean it up. But overall, I think the series is pretty good, and I think it's one of those like hidden gems. Next is Spark of the Everflame by Penn and Glow of the Everflame by Penn. This is book 1 and book 2 of the Everflame series. I'm putting them together because I put both of them at 4 stars. I'd solidly consider this series a young adult romantasy, but a very good young adult romantasy because it introduces a lot of base level concepts in a way that I think is consumable for young adults, but also is good for like introductory fantasy readers or just someone who's looking for something a little bit lighter and like less thinking involved. I also really like that they have both a map and like a small definition list of each one of the sections in the map. After I had read the first book, when I went into the second book, I realized what it was and why it was there. The pacing in these first two books is good, the character building is pretty good, the magic system makes sense and is well established and built upon. What is going on is foreshadowed and signaled to, but I don't think it's telegraphed quite as obviously as it is in Fourth Wing, which, you know, lets the reader have a moment to sort of think about it and sit with it. So Romantasy is part fantasy, part romance, and usually it tips one way or the other. This series, I think, tips more strongly into the fantasy genre than the romance genre, especially because I don't find the romance between Diem and Luther to be especially compelling. They keep hard resetting their relationship. There's really not that many steamy scenes. I don't think that the character descriptions are that good. I keep thinking of Luther as Rhysand. Like, that's just who I imagine in my head, and I keep putting bat wings on the guy, and there's nothing here that says the guy has wings. It's got a little bit of that fun Hunger Games-y element, especially in the second book where she's the queen, but they could kill her off in the last battle royale and someone else gets to be queen then. And that also introduced sort of like a fun politics element and a natural way to kind of like help us meet all these other people and characters that we haven't got to see yet. I really like Diem, where she's coming from, how she's acting as she's learning. I like how mysterious Diem's mother is and like where she stands, what her larger goals and intentions were. And as it is right now, a lot of what she does doesn't make any sense to me. I also like Diem's adopted father. My main issue with him is that the argument between him and Diem before Diem finds out that she's the new queen feels very contrived and kind of out of left field, like compared to how he has been described and how he has been acting up to this point. I do think the series has what I call a weird relationship with religion. Like, basically they're saying there's these old human gods, then there's the kindred, who are gods that ended up meeting with humans and creating the descended, and the kindred are up in whatever realm and the descended are here on earth ruling it. And to me, that sort of proves that gods are real. So if you know the gods are real and you know one set of gods overthrew the other set, then it feels like there should be definite worship, definite holidays, celebrations, offering definite temples and dedications and all these other things. And there's not that kind of structure or certainty about the gods. And that feels very confusing to me. And it feels a little bit like a missed opportunity if you're gonna, you know, base this one being fighting with this other beings off of like their connection to a god. And that rolls me into Goldfinch by Raven Kennedy. I do have a vlogging series of me attempting to read this story and comment on it as I read, and spoiler alert, it goes about as well as any of my other vlogging attempts, which is not very well. I haven't decided if it's worth editing and releasing yet, but if you'd like to see that kind of vlog, let me know in the comments down below. For me personally, Goldfinch is like a 2 to a 2.5 stars, and I have boosted it a lot up to 4 stars, mostly out of respect for the series as a whole. I think if you're into this series for the romantic element, then this is a very fulfilling conclusion. And if you're into the series for the fantasy elements, I think this lets you down a lot. Some of the holes that have always existed in this series are very prevalent in this book. Questions about how the magic works or overall world building or like fae, they all come together here to just not make a very strong end. There's literally a million gajillion endings on this book, like in Lord of the Rings, and the same way I hate it in Lord of the Rings, I hate it here. I was done with this book at the 75% mark when Slade and his father have their final face-off. I should also say that I didn't really 100% finish this book because after Slade shows that his like baby dragon is back, I was like, I'm done with this series. Nothing is earned. Nothing feels good anymore. Let's move on. Overall, I'm glad I read the book. I'm glad I finished the series. There were some great moments in it, specifically like for Oren, like triumphing over the attempt at mind control, her fighting the king. I think that might be it. Ooh, that makes it sound really bad. This doesn't really deserve 4 stars, guys. I put it here out of respect for the series. I really wish there were a couple more moments I could point to off the top that justified this rating. Sorry. And that's gonna be everything that I've read this past September. But talk to me in those comments down below. What did you read this past month and what was your favorite among them? And as always, keep reading.